Hello everybody, and how are you? I'm Jev and I'm here to read stories to you. Today we're going to be reading the last two chapters of a book called The Woudlbegoods by a lady called Edith Nesbit. It's another one of the old-fashioned stories that I read because that's the stories that I read, and hopefully that's the stories you like and that's why you're here. I'm a great believer in finding out about other places and other times and other people, and a great way to do that is to read and listen to stories about, they might be imaginary stories, but stories that were written in another time and place. Not necessarily about another time and place, but written in a different time and place, because they show how society has changed, places are different from each other. Anyway, it's a great way to open up our minds and our perceptions of the world that we live in, because it's not all just our own backyard. So before we start, make sure you have something to drink, something to eat, and somewhere comfortable to sit so you can listen. You're most welcome to lurk. I don't expect you to chat in the chat box because I will be reading to you. I will chat between chapters, but that's about it. So without anything further to say, I shall commence. We are reading The Woudlbegoods by E. Nesbit. The Woudlbegoods subtitle is Being the Further Adventures of the Treasure Seekers, and today's reading is the last two chapters of the book, and this first chapter is chapter 13, The Dragon's Teeth or Army Seed. So here we go. Albert's uncle was out on his bicycle as usual, after the day when we became Canterbury pilgrims and were brought home in the dog cart with the red wheels by the lady he told us was his long-lost grandmother he had known years ago in India. He spent not nearly so much of his time in writing, and he used to shave every morning instead of only when requisite, as in earlier days, and he was always going out on his bicycle in his new Norfolk suit. We are not so unobserving as grown-up people make out. We knew well enough that he was looking for the long-lost, and we jolly well wished he might find her. Oswald, always full of sympathy with misfortune, however undeserved, had himself tried several times to find the lady. I'm just going to change the size of the lettering on my page because I was doing something before and the words are a little small to read comfortably. Here we go. Carrying on. Had tried several times himself to find the lady, so had the others, but all this is what they call a digression. It has nothing to do with the dragon's teeth I am now narrating. It began with the pig dying. It was the one we had had for the circus, but it having behaved so badly that day had nothing to do with its illness and death, though the girls say they felt remorse, and perhaps if we hadn't made it run so that day, it might have been spared to us. But Oswald cannot pretend that people were right just because they happened to be dead, and as long as that pig was alive, we all knew well enough that it was that made us run and not us it. They had pretended having a circus, and they had used farm animals, one of which was the pig, and then the pig had escaped from the paddock, the field that they were in, and they had to try and catch it, and it ran for miles and miles and miles. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. That's better. Right. So that's because our stories have not been read, our chapters haven't been read right through from one into the next, all the way through the book. I'm just catching you up if you haven't heard the rest of the story before. So it was the pig that made us run, not us it. The pig was buried in the kitchen garden. Bill, that we made the tombstone for, soldier who had actually, everyone thought was dead, but actually turned out to have just been missing, Bill dug the grave, and while he was away at his dinner, we took a turn at digging because we liked to be useful. Oh dear, here it comes. And besides, when you dig, you never know what you may turn up. I knew a man once that found a gold ring on the point of his fork when he was digging potatoes, and you know how we found 2 half-crowns ourselves once when we were digging for treasure. Oswald was taking his turn with the spade, and the others were sitting on the gravel and telling him how to do it. Work with a will, Dickie said, yawning. Alice said, I wish we were in a book. People in books never dig without finding something. I think I'd rather it was a secret passage than anything. Oswald stopped to wipe his honest brow ere replying. Oswald's our narrator, and he tries to sound well-educated, and so he speaks using phrases and words from, or ones that he thinks he has remembered from other books that they have read. Not always successfully, not always correctly, the words that he is choosing to say. Anyway, we'll carry on. Oswald stopped to wipe his honest brow ere replying. A secret's nothing when you've found it out. Look at that at the secret staircase. It's no good, not even for hide and seek, because of its squeaking. I'd rather have the pot of gold we used to dig for when we were little. That's when they were the treasure seekers. It was really only last year, but you seem to grow old very quickly after you have once passed the prime of your youth, which is 10, I believe. That was his aside. Now, how would you like to find the mouldering bones of royalist soldiers foully done to death by nasty Ironsides? That's the Civil War, the English Civil War. Cromwell was referred to as Ironsides. Noel asked with his mouth full of plum. If they were really dead, it wouldn't matter, Dora said. What I'm afraid of is a skeleton that can walk about and catch at your legs when you're going upstairs to bed. Skeletons can't walk, Alice said in a hurry. You know they can't, Dora. And she glared at Dora till she made her sorry that she had said what she had. The things you are frightened of, or even those you would rather not meet in the dark, should never be mentioned before the little ones, or else they cry when it comes to bedtime and say it was because of what you said. We shan't find anything, no jolly fear, said Dickie, and just then my spade I was digging with struck on something hard, and it felt hollow. I really did think for one joyful space that we had found that pot of gold, but the thing, whatever it was, seemed to be longish, longer, that is, than a pot of gold would normally be, and as I uncovered it I saw that it was not at all a pot of gold, but like a bone Pincher had buried. So Oswald said, It is the skeleton. The girls all drew back, and Alice said, Oswald, I wish you wouldn't. A moment later the discovery was unearthed, and Oswald lifted it up with both hands. It is a dragon's head, said Noel, and it certainly looked like it. It was long and narrowish and bony, and with great yellow teeth sticking in the jaw. Bill came back just then and said it was a horse's head. But H.O. and Noel would not believe it, and Oswald owns that no horse he has ever seen had a head at all that shape. So it sounds like they've buried dead animals in the garden before, probably down deep enough. Sorry, I'm just moving my chair because it scoots away otherwise. If you bury it down deep enough, then the smell isn't a problem, but it actually adds nutrition back into your soil for growing things. Oswald owns that no horse he has ever seen had a head at all that shape, but Oswald did not stop to argue because he saw a keeper who showed me how to set snares going by, and he wanted to talk to him about ferrets. So he went off, and Dickie and Denny and Alice with him. I'm going to turn the sound off on my phone, just because it shouldn't be on, because it's distracting us. Anyway, and we shall carry on. Oswald did not stop to argue because he saw a keeper who showed me how to set snares going by, and he wanted to talk to him about ferrets. So he went off, and Dickie and Denny and Alice with him. Also, Daisy and Dora went off to finish reading Ministering Children. It's one of those improving books by the sound of it. So H.O. and Noel were left with the bony head. They took it away. The incident had quite faded from the mind of Oswald the next day, but just before breakfast Noel and H.O. came in looking hot and anxious. They had got up early and had not washed at all, not even their hands and faces. Noel made Oswald a secret signal. All the others saw it, and with proper delicate feeling pretended not to have. When Oswald had gone out with Noel and H.O. in obedience to the secret signal, Noel said, You know that dragon's head yesterday? Well, Oswald said quickly, but not crossly. The two things are quite different. Well, you know what happened in Greek history when some chap sowed dragon's teeth, using them as seeds in a garden? They came up armed men, said H.O. But Noel sternly bade him shut up, and Oswald said, well, again. If he spoke impatiently, it was because he smelt the bacon being taken into breakfast. I think he doesn't want to miss out and he's hungry. Well, Noel went on, what do you suppose would come up if we sowed those dragon's teeth we found yesterday? Why, nothing, you young duffer, said Oswald, who could now smell the coffee. All that isn't history, it's humbug. Come on into brekker. It's not humbug, H.O. cried. It is history. We did so. Shut up, said Noel again. Look here, Oswald. We did sow those dragon's teeth in Randall's 10-acre meadow, and what do you think has come up? Toadstools, I should think, was Oswald's contemptible rejoinder. They have come up a camp of soldiers, said Noel. Armed men. So you see, it was history. We have sowed army seed just like Cadmus, and it has come up. It was a very wet night. I dare say that helped it along. Oswald could not decide which to disbelieve, his brother or his ears. So, disguising his doubtful emotions without a word, he led the way to the bacon and the banqueting hall. He said nothing about the army seed then, neither did Noel and H.O., but after the bacon we went into the garden, and then the good elder brother said, why don't you tell the others your cock and bull story? So they did, and their story was received with warm expressions of doubt. It was Dicky who observed, let's go and have a squint at Randall's 10-acre anyhow. I saw a hare there the other day. That's the name of the field that they saw the camp of soldiers in. We went. It is some little way, and as we went, disbelief reigned supreme, another misuse, in every breast except Noel's and H.O.'s, so you will see that even the ready pen of the present author cannot be expected to describe to you his variable sensations when he got to the top of the hill and suddenly saw that his little brothers had spoken the truth. I do not mean that they generally tell lies, but people make mistakes sometimes, and the effect is the same as lies if you believe them. There was a camp there with real tents and soldiers in grey and red tunics. I dare say the girls would have said coats, red coats. We stood in ambush, too astonished even to think of lying in ambush, though of course we know that is customary. The ambush was the wood on top of the little hill between Randall's 10-acre meadow and Sugden's waste-wake pasture, another local pasture or field with its own special name. There would be cover here for a couple of regiments, whispered Oswald, who was, I think, gifted by fate with the far-seeingness of a born general. Alice merely said, hist, and we went down to mingle with the troops as though by accident and seek for information. The first man we came to at the edge of the camp was cleaning a sort of cauldron thing, like witches brew bats in. We went up to him and said, who are you? Are you English or are you the enemy? We are the enemy, he said, and he did not seem ashamed of being what he was, and he spoke English with quite a good accent for a foreigner. The enemy, Oswald echoed in shocked tones. It is a terrible thing to be a loyal and patriotic youth, to see an enemy cleaning a pot in an English field with English sand and looking as much at home as if he was in his foreign fastnesses. The enemy seemed to read Oswald's thoughts with deadly unerringness. He said, the English are somewhere over on the other side of the hill. They are trying to keep us out of Maidstone. After this, our plan of mingling with the troops did not seem worth going on with. This soldier, in spite of his unerringness in reading Oswald's innermost heart, seemed not so very sharp in other things, or he would never have given away his secret plans like this. For he must have known from our accents that we were Britons to the backbone, or perhaps, Oswald thought this, and it made his blood at once boil and freeze, which our uncle has told us was possible, but only in India. Perhaps he thought that Maidstone was really as good as taken, and it didn't matter what he said. While Oswald was debating within his intellect what to say next and how to say it so as to discover as many as possible of the enemy's dark secrets, Noel said, "How did you get here? You weren't here yesterday at tea time." The soldier gave the pot another sandy rub. When you're cooking over a fire and you're using old-fashioned cast iron items, and like when you're camping or something like that, you often use sand to rub the dirt off the inside and the outside, because it's like using a scratchy pad like we do in a sink now, except that the sand is there, and in these days they didn't have those scratchy pad things, so that's why he's using sand. It's quite common. It used to be quite common. The soldier gave the pot another sandy rub and said, "I dare say it does seem quick work. The camp seems as if it had sprung up like in the night, doesn't it? Like a mushroom." Alice and Oswald looked at each other and then at the rest of us. The words "sprung up in the night" seemed to touch a string in every heart. "You see," whispered Noel, "he won't tell us how he came here. Now, is it humbug or history?" Oswald, after another one of Oswald's words, whisperedly requesting his young brother to dry up and not bother, remarked, "Then you're an invading army?" "Well," said the soldier, "we're a skeleton battalion, as a matter of fact, but we're invading all right enough." "Oh dear," he said, the key word there. And now indeed the blood of the stupidest of us froze, just as the quick-witted Oswald's had done earlier in the interview. Even H.O. opened his mouth and went the colour of mottled soap. Soap used to be homemade, and if it wasn't mixed well, it was mottled. It didn't look healthy at all. Even H.O. opened his mouth and went the colour of mottled soap. "He is so fat that this is the nearest he can go to turning pale." Denny said, "But you don't look like skeletons." The soldier stared. Then he laughed and said, "Ah, that's the padding in our tunics. You should see us in the grey dawn, taking our morning bath in a bucket." It was a dreadful picture for the imagination. A skeleton, with its bones all loose, most likely, bathing anyhow in a pail. There was a silence while we thought it over. Now, ever since the cleaning cauldron soldier had said that about taking Maidstone, Alice had kept on pulling at Oswald's jacket behind, and he had kept on not taking any notice. But now he could not stand it any longer, so he said, "Well, what is it?" Alice drew him aside, or rather she pulled at his jacket so that he nearly fell over backwards, and then she whispered, "Come along, don't stay here parleying with the foe. He's only talking to you to gain time." "What for?" said Oswald. "Why, so that we shouldn't warn the other army, you silly," Alice said, and Oswald was so upset by what she said that he forgot to be properly angry with her for the wrong word she used. "But we ought to warn them at home," she said. "Suppose the moat house was burned down and all the supplies commandeered for the foe?" Alice turned boldly to the soldier. "Do you burn down farms?" she asked. "Well, not as a rule," he said, and he had the cheek to wink at Oswald, but Oswald would not look at him. "We've not burned a farm since, not for years." I think he's a guy who thinks the kids are just playing a game. Anyway, doesn't matter. Let's just enjoy it. "A farm in Greek history it was, I expect," Denny murmured. "Civilized warriors do not burn farms nowadays," Alice said sternly. "Whatever they did in Greek times, you ought to know that." The soldier said things had changed a good deal since Greek times, so we said good morning as quickly as we could. It is proper to be polite even to your enemy, except just at that moment when it has really come to rifles and bayonets or other weapons. The soldier said "so long" in quite a modern voice, and we traced our footsteps in silence to the the wood. Oswald did think of lying in the ambush then, but it was rather wet because of the rain the night before, that H.O. said had brought the army seed up, the rain had. And Alice walked very fast, saying nothing but "Hurry up, can't you?" and dragged H.O. by one hand and Noel by the other. So we got into the road. Then Alice faced round and said, "This is all our fault. If we hadn't sewed those dragon's teeth, there wouldn't have been any invading army." "I am sorry to say," Daisy said. "Never mind, Alice dear. We didn't sew the nasty things, did we, Dora?" Oh dear. But Denny told her it was just the same. It was we had done it, so long as it was any of us, especially if it got any of us into trouble. Oswald was very pleased to see that the dentist was beginning to understand the meaning of true manliness and about the honour of the House of Bastable, though of course he is only a Fawkes. Yet it is something to know he does his best to learn. If you are very grown-up or very clever, I dare say you will now have thought of a great many things. If you have, you need not say anything, especially if you are reading this aloud to anybody. Maybe he should have warned us at that beginning. It is no good putting in what you think in this part, because none of us thought of anything of the kind at the time. We simply stood in the road without any of your clever thoughts, filled with shame and distress to think of what might happen owing to the dragon's teeth being sown. It was a lesson to us never to sow seeds without being quite sure what sort it is. This is particularly true of the penny packets, which sometimes do not come up at all, quite unlike dragon's teeth. Of course, H.O. and Noel were more unhappy than the rest of us. This was only fair. "How can we possibly prevent their getting to Maidstone?" Dickie said. "Did you notice the red cuffs on their uniforms? That's taken from the bodies of dead English soldiers, I shouldn't wonder." "If they're the old Greek kind of dragon's teeth soldiers, they ought to fight each other to death," Noel said. "At least, if we had a helmet to throw amongst them." But none of us had, and it was decided that it would be of no use for H.O. to go back and throw his straw hat at them, though he wanted to. Denny said suddenly, "Couldn't we alter the signposts so that they couldn't know the way to Maidstone?" Oswald saw that this was the time for true generalship to be shown. He said, "Fetch all the tools out of your chest. Dickie, go too. There's a good chap, and don't let him cut his legs with the saw." He did once, tumbling over it. "Meet us at the crossroads, you know, where we had the benevolent bar. Courage and dispatch, and look sharp about it." When they had gone, we hastened to the crossroads, and there a great idea occurred to Oswald. He used the forces at his command so ably that in a very short time the board in the field which says "No thoroughfare, trespassers will be prosecuted," was set up in the middle of the road to Maidstone. We put stones from a heap by the road behind it to make it stand up. Then Dickie and Denny came back, and Dickie shinned up the signpost and sawed off the two arms, and we nailed them up wrong so that it said "To Maidstone" on the Dover road and "To Dover" on the road to Maidstone. We decided to leave the trespassers board on the real Maidstone road as an extra guard. Then we settled to start at once to warn Maidstone. Some of us did not want the girls to go, but it would have been unkind to say so. However, there was at least one breast that felt a pang of joy when Dora and Daisy gave out that they would rather stay where they were and tell anybody who came by which was the real road. Because it would be so dreadful if someone was going to buy pigs or fetch a doctor or anything in a hurry and then found out that they had got to Dover instead of where they wanted to go to, Dora said. But when it came to dinner time, they went home, so that they were entirely out of it. This often happens to them by some strange fatalism. We left Martha to take care of the two girls, and Lady and Pincher went with us. Those are the dogs. It was getting late in the day, but I'm bound to remember no one said anything about their dinners, whatever they may have thought. We cannot always help our thoughts. We happened to know that it was roast rabbits and currant jelly that day. Currant jelly to go with the rabbit. It's quite good. It's like having cranberry sauce with turkey. We walked two and sang the British Grenadiers and Soldiers of the Queen, so as to be as much part of the British Army as possible. The cauldron man had said the English were the other side of the hill, but we could not see any scarlet anywhere, though we looked for it as carefully as if we had been fierce bulls. But suddenly we went round a turn in the road and came plump up into a lot of soldiers. Only they were not red coats. They were dressed in grey and silver, and it was a sort of furzy common place, and 3 roads branching out. The men were lying about with some of their belts undone, smoking pipes and cigarettes. "It's not British soldiers," Alice said. Oh dear, I'm afraid it's more enemy. You didn't sow the army seed elsewhere, did you, H.O. dear?" H.O. was positive he hadn't, but perhaps lots more came up when we did sow them. He said, "They're all over England by now, very likely." "I don't know how many men can grow out of one dragon's tooth." Then Noel said, "It was my doing anyhow, and I'm not afraid," and he walked straight up to the nearest soldier who was cleaning his pipe with a piece of grass and said, "Please, are you the enemy?" The man said, "No, young Commander-in-Chief, we're the English." Then Oswald took command. "Where is the general?" "We're out of generals just now, Field Marshal," said the man. And his voice was a gentleman's voice, not a single one in stock. "We might suit you in majors now, and captains are quite cheap, competent corporals going for a song, and we have a very nice colonel, too quiet to ride or drive." Oswald did not mind chaff at proper times, that's being teased, but this was not one. "You seem to be taking it very easy," he said, with disdainful expression. "This isn't easy." When soldiers have been working and walking and hiking, marching and stuff like that, they will take an easy, which is a rest break. Like when you're in formation, you stand at attention, you stand at ease, which is a more relaxed stance, but you can maintain it for a long time. And then the stand easy, which is where you can actually relax, and that's related to an easy, which is where you're not having to be in formation or anything, it's just taking a break. "I suppose you don't care if the enemy gets into Maidstone or not," exclaimed Oswald bitterly. "If I were a soldier, I'd rather die than be beaten." The soldier saluted. "Good old patriotic sentiment," he said, smiling at the heartfelt boy. But Oswald could bear no more. "Which is the colonel?" he said. "Over there, near the grey horse." "The one lighting a cigarette?" H.O. asked. "Yes, but I say, kiddie, he won't stand any jaw. There's not an ounce of vice about him, but he's peppery. He might kick out. You'd better bunk." "Better what?" asked H.O. "Bunk, bottle, scoot, skip, vanish, exit," said the soldier. "That's what you'd do when the fighting begins," said H.O. "He's often rude like that, but it was what we all thought, all the same." The soldier only laughed. A spirited but hasty altercation among ourselves in whispers ended in our allowing Alice to be the one to speak to the colonel. It was she who wanted to. "However peppery he is, he won't kick a girl," she said, and perhaps this was true. But of course we all went with her. So there were 6 of us to stand in front of the colonel, and as we went along we agreed that we would salute him on the word 3. So when we got near, Dick said 1, 2, 3, and we all saluted very well, except H.O., who chose that minute to trip over a rifle a soldier had left lying about, and was only saved from falling by a man in a cocked hat who caught him deftly by the back of his jacket and stood him on his legs. "Let go, can't you?" said H.O. "Are you the general?" Before the cocked hat had time to frame a reply, Alice spoke to the colonel. I knew what she meant to say because she had told me as we threaded our way among the resting soldiery. What she really said was, "How can you?" "How can I what?" said the colonel rather crossly. "Why, smoke," said Alice. "My good children, if you're an infant band of hope, let me recommend you to play in some other backyard," said the cock-hatted man. It's a hat it's been folded so it's got a point, or set at an angle. H.O. said, "Band of hope yourself," but no one noticed it. "We're not a band of hope," said Noel. "We're British, and the man over there told us you are, and Maidstone's in danger and the enemy not a mile off, and you stand smoking." Noel was standing crying himself, or something very like it. "It's quite true," Alice said. The colonel said, "Fiddle-dee-dee," but the cock-hatted man said, "What was the enemy like?" We told him exactly. And even the colonel then owned there might be something in it. "Can you show me the place where they are on the map?" he asked. "Not on the map we can't," said Dickie. "At least I don't think so, but on the ground we could. We could take you there in 1/4 of an hour." The cocked-hatted one looked at the colonel, who returned his scrutiny. Then he shrugged his shoulders. "Well, we've got to do something," he said, as if to himself. Lead on, Macduff. The colonel roused his soldiery from their stupor of pipes by words of command that the present author is sorry he can't remember. Then he bade us boys lead the way. I tell you it felt fine, marching at the head of a regiment. Alice got a lift on the cocked-hatted one's horse. It was a red roan steed of might, exactly as if it had been in a ballad. They call a grey roan a blue in South Africa, the cocked-hatted one said. We led the British army by unfrequented lanes till we got to the gate of Sugden's wake pasture. Then the colonel called a whispered halt, and choosing 2 of us to guide him, the dauntless and discerning commander went on foot, with an orderly. He chose Dickie and Oswald as guides, so we led him to the ambush, and we went through it as quietly as we could, but twigs do crackle and snap, so when you are reconnoitring or anxious to escape detection for whatever do snap so when you are reconnoitring or anxious to escape detection for whatever reason. Our colonel's orderly crackled the most. If you're not near enough to tell a colonel by the crown and stars on his shoulder strap, you can tell him by the orderly behind him, like, follow my leader. Look out, said Oswald in a low but commanding whisper. The camp's down in that field. You can see if you take a squint through this gap. The speaker took a squint himself as he spoke, and drew back, baffled beyond the power of speech. While he was struggling with his baffledness, the British colonel had his squint. He also drew back, and said a word that he must have known was not right, at least when he was a boy. I don't care, said Oswald. They were there this morning, white tents like mushrooms, and an enemy cleaning a cauldron with sand, said Dickie. That's most convincing, said the colonel, and I did not like the way he said it. I say, Oswald said, let's go to the top corner of the ambush, the wood, I mean. You can see the crossroads from there. We did, and quickly, for the crackling of the branches no longer dismayed our almost despairing spirits. We came to the edge of the wood, and Oswald's patriotic heart really did give a jump, and he cried, There they are, on the Dover Road. Our miscellaneous signboard had done its work. By Jove, young'un, you're right, and in quarter column too. We've got 'em on toast, egad. I never heard anyone not in a book say egad before, so I saw something really out of the way was indeed up. The colonel was a man of prompt and decisive action. He sent the orderly to tell the major to advance 2 companies on the left flank and take cover. Then we led him back through the wood with the nearest way, because he said he must rejoin the main body at once. We found the main body very friendly with Noel and H.O. and the others, and Alice was talking to the cocked-hatted one as if she had known him all her life. I think he's a general in disguise, Noel said. He's been giving us chocolate out of a pocket in his saddle. Oswald thought about the roast rabbit then, and he was not ashamed to own it, yet he did not say a word. But Alice is really not a bad sort. She had saved 2 bars of chocolate for him and Dickie. Even in war, girls can sometimes be useful in their humble way. The colonel fussed about and said, Take cover there, and everybody hid in the ditch, and the horses and the cocked hat with Alice retreated down the road out of sight. We were in the ditch too. It was muddy, but nobody thought of their boots in that in that perilous moment. Sorry, I need a drink of water. But nobody thought of their boots in that perilous moment. It seemed a long time we were crouching there. Oswald began to feel the water squelching in his boots, so we held our breath and listened. Oswald laid his ear to the road like a Red Indian. You would not do this in time of peace, but when your country is in danger, you care but little about keeping your ears clean. His backwoods strategy was successful. He rose and dusted himself and said, They're coming. It was true. The footsteps of the approaching foe were now to be heard quite audibly, even by ears in their natural position. The wicked enemy approached. They were marching with a careless swaggeringness that showed how little they suspected the horrible doom which was about to teach them England's might and supremeness. He's loving his big words. Just as the enemy turned the corner so that we could see them, the colonel shouted, "Right section, fire!" And there was a deafening banging. The enemy's officer said something, and then the enemy got confused and tried to get into the fields through the hedges, but all was in vain. There was firing now from our men on the left as well as the right, and then our colonel strode nobly up to the enemy's colonel and demanded surrender. He told me so afterwards. His exact words are only known to himself and the other colonel, but the enemy's colonel said, "I would rather die than surrender," or words to that effect. Our colonel returned to his men and gave the order to fix bayonets, and even Oswald felt his manly cheek turn pale at the thought of the amount of blood to be shed. What would have happened can never now be revealed, for at this moment a man on a piebald horse came clattering over a hedge as carelessly as if the air was not full of lead and steel at all. Another man rode behind him with a lance and a red pennon on it. I think he must have been the enemy's general, coming to tell his men not to throw away their lives on a forlorn hope, for directly he said they were captured, the enemy gave in and owned that they were. The enemy's colonel saluted and ordered his men to form quarter column again. I should have thought he would have had about enough of that myself. That's the marching formation. He had now given up all thought of sullen resistance to the bitter end. He rolled a cigarette from himself and had the foreign cheek to say to our colonel, "By Jove, old man, you got me clean that time. Your scouts seem to have marked us down uncommonly neatly." It was a proud moment when our colonel laid his military hand on Oswald's shoulder and said, "This is my chief scout," which were high words but not undeserved, and Oswald owns he felt red with gratifying pride when he heard them. "So you are the traitor young man," said the wicked colonel, going on with his cheek. Oswald bore it because our colonel had, and you should be generous to a fallen foe, but it is hard to be called a traitor when you haven't. He did not treat the wicked colonel with silent scorn as he might have done, but said, "We aren't traitors. We are the Bastables, and one of us is a Fawkes. We only mingled unsuspected with the enemy's soldiery and learned the secrets of their acts, which is what Baden-Powell always does when the natives rebel in South Africa. And Dennis Fawkes thought of altering the signposts to lead the foe astray, and if we did cause all this fighting and get Maidstone threatened with capture and all that, it was only because we didn't believe Greek things could happen in Great Britain and Ireland, even if you sew dragon's teeth, and besides, some of us were not asked about sewing them." That would have been a confusing thing for the soldiers. Then the cocked-hatted one led his horse and walked with us and made us tell him all about it. And so did the colonel. The wicked colonel listened too, which was only another proof of his cheek. And Oswald told the tale in the modest yet manly way that some people think he has, and gave the others all the credit they deserved. His narration was interrupted no less than 4 times by shouts of "Bravo!" in which the enemy's colonel once more showed his cheek. By joining. By the time the story was told, we were in sight of another camp. It was the British one this time. The colonel asked us to have tea in his tent, and it only shows the magnanimosity of English chivalry in the field of battle that he asked the enemy's colonel too. With his usual cheek he accepted. We were jolly hungry. When everyone had had as much tea as they possibly could, the colonel shook hands with us all, and to Oswald he said, "Well, goodbye, my brave scout. I must mention your name in my dispatches to the War Office." H.O. interrupted him to say, "His name's Oswald Cecil Bastable and mine's Horace Octavius." I wish H.O. would learn to hold his tongue. No one ever knows Oswald was christened Cecil as well, if he can possibly help it. You didn't know it till now. "Mr. Oswald Bastable," the colonel went on, he had the decency not to take any notice of the Cecil, "you would be a credit to any regiment. No doubt the War Office will reward you properly for what you have done for your country, but meantime, perhaps you'll accept 5 shillings from a grateful comrade-in-arms." Oswald felt heartfelt sorry to wound the good colonel's feelings, but he had to remark that he had only done his duty, and he was sure no British scout would take 5 bob for doing that. And besides, he said, with that feeling of justice which is part of his young character, it was the others just as much as me. Your sentiments, sir, said the colonel, who was one of the politest and most discerning colonels I ever saw, your sentiments do you honour, but Bastables all, and non-Bastables, he couldn't remember Fawkes, it's not such an interesting name as Bastable, of course, at least you'll accept a soldier's pay. Lucky to touch it, a shilling a day, Alice and Denny said together, and the cocked-hatted man said something about knowing your own mind and knowing your own Kipling. So it's obviously a quote from Rudyard Kipling. A soldier, said the colonel, would certainly be lucky to touch it. You see, there are deductions for rations. 5 shillings is exactly right, deducting 2pence each for 6 teas. This seemed cheap for the 3 cups of tea and the 3 eggs and all the strawberry jam and bread and butter Oswald had, as well as what the others ate, and ladies and pinchers' teas, but I suppose soldiers get things cheaper than civilians, which is only right. Oswald took the 5 shillings then, there being no longer any scruples why he should not. Just as we had parted from the brave colonel and the rest, we saw a bicycle coming. It was Albert's uncle. We'll find out what's about to happen. Oh dear. Possibly. There seems to always be a bit of an oh dear, doesn't there? It was Albert's uncle. He got off and said, "What on earth have you been up to? What were you doing with those volunteers?" We told him the wild adventures of the day. We told him the wild adventures of the day, and he listened, and then he said he would withdraw the word volunteers, if we liked. But the seeds of doubt were sown in the breast of Oswald. He was now almost sure that we had made jolly fools of ourselves without a moment's pause throughout the whole of this eventful day. He said nothing at the time, but after supper he had it out with Albert's uncle about the word which had been withdrawn. Not quite sure where this is going. Albert's uncle said of course no one could be sure that the dragon's teeth hadn't come up in the good old-fashioned way, but that, on the other hand, it was barely possible that both the British and the enemy were only volunteers having a field day or sham fight, and he rather thought the cocked-hatted man was not a general but a doctor, and the man with a red pennon carried behind him might have been the umpire. Oswald never told the others a word of this. Their young breasts were all panting with joy because they had saved their country, and it would have been but heartless unkindness to show them how silly they had been. Besides, Oswald felt he was much too old to have been so taken in. If he had been. Besides, Albert's uncle did say that no one could be sure about the dragon's teeth. The thing that makes Oswald feel most that perhaps the whole thing was a beastly sell was that we didn't see any wounded. But he tries not to think of this, and if he goes into the army when he grows up, he will not go quite green. He has had the experience of the arts of war and the tented field, and a real colonel has called him comrade-in-arms, which is exactly what Lord Roberts called his own soldiers when he wrote home about them. So there's the end of that chapter. Sorry, I should have said that. So, what do you think? I think, yes, as they oddly phrased it because it's an old book, that, they were a group of volunteers out practice battles, and they had an umpire and a doctor to make sure that if anyone did get hurt by being tripped over or falling off their horse or accidentally whacked by somebody else, that they would have medical aid. But yes, it would have been quite exciting for the children to have discovered something like that going on right near where they live. Oh, that would have been such a laugh. Anyway, so this is now chapter break. Now's when you have your drink of water. Go on, you need to have your drink of water. And if you need to, go and run off to the loo. I'll be just a moment. I've just got to check something online. So, quick, go and get your drink of water. Get your snacks now if you didn't get them before. and then I'll start reading again in a minute, just a minute or two. And it's going to be the last chapter of the book. And then I've got to figure out what book I'm going to read after that. Interesting. Sorry, itchy nose. Yeah. Right. Have you gone and had your something to eat or drink? Have you been to the loo? Are you ready for me to keep reading? Let's carry on. Right, chapter 14. I am reading The Wouldbegoods by Edith Nesbit, which is the further adventures of the treasure seekers, which was the previous book we had read. And I'm reading the last chapter, which is chapter 14, Albert's Uncle's Grandmother, or The Long Lost. Remember in our previous one with the pilgrims, there was a lady who rescued them and brought them back in her dog cart, and with the carrier man's cart as well. And the reference in the beginning of the last chapter we had was that she was Albert's uncle's grandmother, which seems a little bit odd, but we'll find out because I don't think she was that old. Anyway, chapter 14, Albert's uncle's grandmother, or The Long Lost. And I'm saying or because that's the subtitle for the chapter. The shadow of the termination now descended in sable thunderclouds upon our devoted knobs, that's heads. As Albert's uncle said, school now gaped for its prey. In a very short space of time we should be wending our way back to Blackheath, which is where they live in the city, and all the variegated delightfulness of the country would soon be only preserved in memory's faded flowers. They've been spending summer down in the country. I don't care for that way of writing very much. It would be an awful swat to keep it up, looking out the words and all that. So he's going to continue without being so fancy. To speak in the language of everyday life, our holiday was jolly nearly up. We'd had a ripping time, but it was all but over. We really did feel sorry, though, of course, it was rather decent to think of getting back to father and being able to tell the other chaps about our raft and the dam and the Tower of Mystery and things like that. When but a brief time was left to us, Oswald and Dicky met by chance in an apple tree. That sounds like consequences, but it is mere truthfulness. Dicky said, "Only 4 more days." Oswald said, "Yes." "There's one thing," Dicky said, "that beastly society. We don't want that swarming all over everything when we get home. We ought to dissolve it before we leave here." The following dialogue now took place. Oswald, "Right you are. I always said it was piffling rot." Dicky, "So did I." Oswald, "Let's call a council, but don't forget we've jolly well got to put our foot down." Dicky assented, and the dialogue concluded with apples. They were in an apple tree after all. The council, when called, was in but low spirits. This made Oswald's and Dicky's task easier. When people are sunk in gloomy despair about one thing, they will agree to almost anything about something else. Remarks like this are called philosophic generalizations, Albert's uncle says. Oswald began by saying, "We've tried the society for being good in, and perhaps it's done us good, but now the time has come for each of us to be good or bad on his own without hanging on to the others. Then he quotes something. The race is run by 1 and 1, but never by 2 and 2, the dentist said. Sorry, that was Denny who said that. The others said nothing. Oswald went on. I move that we dissolve the Woudlbegoods Society. Its appointed task is done. If it's not well done, then it's its fault, not ours. Dickie said, Hear, hear, I second this prop. The unexpected dentist said, I third it. At first I thought it would help, but afterwards I saw it only made you want to be naughty, just because you were a Woudlbegood. Oswald owns he was surprised. We put it to the vote at once, so as not to let Denny cool. H.O. and Noel and Alice voted with us, so Daisy and Dora were what is called a hopeless minority. We tried to cheer their hopelessness by letting them read the things out of the Golden Deed book aloud. Noel hid his face in the straw so that we should not see the faces he made while he made poetry instead of listening, and when the Woudlbegoods was, by vote, dissolved for ever, he sat up, straws in his hair, and said, The epitaph. The Woudlbegoods are dead and gone, but not the golden deeds they've done. These will remain upon glory's page, to be an example to every age, and by this we have got to know how to be good upon our own. He's trying to make it rhyme. N is for Noel, that makes the rhyme, and the sense both right. O-W-N. Do you see? He explained to them. We saw it and said so, and the gentle poet was satisfied, and the council broke up. Oswald felt that a weight had been lifted from his expanding chest, and it is curious that he had never felt so inclined to be good and a model youth as he did then. As he went down the ladder out of the loft, he said, There's one thing we ought to do, though, before we go home. We ought to find Albert's uncle's long-lost grandmother for him. Alice's heart beat true and steadfast. She said, That's just exactly what Noel and I were saying this morning. Look out, Oswald, you wretch, you're kicking chaff into my eyes. She was going down the ladder just under me. Oswald's younger sister's thoughtful remark ended in another council, but not in the straw loft. We decided to have a new place and disregarded H.O.'s idea of the dairy and Noel's of the cellars. We had the new council on the secret staircase, and there we settled exactly what we ought to do. This is the same thing, if you really wish to be good, as what you are going to do. It was a very interesting council, and when it was over, Oswald was so pleased to think that the Woudlbegoods was unrecoverishly dead that he gave Denny and Noel, who were sitting on the step below him, a good-humoured, playful, gentle, loving, brotherly shove, and said, Get along down, it's tea time. No reader who understands justice and the real rightness of things and who is to blame for what will ever think it could have been Oswald's fault that the other two boys got along down by rolling over and over each other and bursting the door at the bottom of the stairs open by their revolving bodies. And I should like to know whose fault it was that Mrs. Pettigrew was just on the other side of the door at that very moment. The door burst open, and the impetuous bodies of Noel and Denny rolled out of it into Mrs. Pettigrew and upset her and the tea tray. Both revolving boys were soaked with tea and milk, and there were 1 or 2 cups and things smashed. Mrs. Pettigrew was knocked over, but none of her bones were broken. Noel and Denny were going to be sent to bed, but Oswald said it was all his fault. He really did this to give the others a chance of doing a refined good deed by speaking the truth and saying it was not his fault. But you cannot really count on anyone. They did not say anything, but only rubbed the lumps on their late revolving heads, so it was bed for Oswald, and he felt the injustice hard. But he sat up in bed and read The Last of the Mohicans, and then he began to think. That's a book, which is still around, by J. Fenimore Cooper, I think it's who wrote that one. And then he began to think. When Oswald really thinks, he almost always thinks of something. He thought of something now, and it was miles better than the idea we had decided on in the secret staircase of advertising in the Kentish Mercury and saying if Albert's uncle's long-lost grandmother would call at the moat house she might hear of something much to her advantage. It's probably just as well they didn't put that in. You don't know who's going to turn up. What Oswald thought of was that if we went to Hazelbridge and asked Mr. B. Munn, the grocer that drove us home in the cart with the horse that liked the wrong end of the whip best, he would know who the lady was in the red hat and red wheels that paid him to drive us home that Canterbury night. He must have been paid, of course, for even grocers are not generous enough to drive perfect strangers, and 5 of them too, about the country for nothing. That's a good bit of logic on the kid's part, isn't it? Oh, my nose. Sorry. Thus, we may learn that even unjustness and sending the wrong people to bed may bear useful fruit, which ought to be a great comfort to everyone when they are unfairly treated. Only it most likely won't be, for if Oswald's brothers and sisters had nobly stood by him as he expected, he would not have had the solitary reflections that led to the great scheme for finding the grandmother. Of course, when the others came up to roost, they all came and squatted on Oswald's bed and said how sorry they were. He waived their apologies with noble dignity, because there wasn't much time, and said he had an idea that would knock the council's plan into a cocked hat, but he would not tell them what it was. He made them wait till next morning. This was not sulks, but kind feeling. He wanted them to have something else to think of besides the way they hadn't stood by him in the bursting of the secret staircase door and the tea tray and the milk. Next morning Oswald kindly explained and asked who would volunteer for a forced march to Hazelbridge. The word volunteer cost the young Oswald a pang as soon as he had said it. But I hope he can bear pangs with any man living, and mind, he added, hiding the pang under a general-like severeness. He's thinking of the previous chapter, that it was volunteers practicing, not real soldiers. The secret he was going to keep. Hiding the pang under a general-like severeness. I won't have anyone on the expedition who has anything in his shoes except his feet. This could not have been put more delicately and decently, but Oswald is often misunderstood. Even Alice said it was unkind to throw the peas up at Denny. When this little unpleasantness had passed away, it took some time because Daisy cried and Dora said, "There now, Oswald." There were 7 volunteers, which, with Oswald, made 8, and was indeed all of us. There were no cockle shells, or tape sandals, or staves, or scrips, or anything romantic and pious about the 8 persons who set out for Hazelbridge that morning, more earnestly wishful to be good and deedful, at least Oswald I know was, than ever they had been in the days of the beastly Wouldbegoods society. It was a fine day. Either it was fine nearly all last summer, which is how Oswald remembers it, or else nearly all the interesting things we did came on fine days. That can happen too. With hearts light and gay and no peas in anyone's shoes, the walk to Hazelbridge was perseveringly conducted. There's a line break there. It makes it weird to read. We took our lunch with us and the dear dogs. Afterwards we wished for a time that we had left one of them at home, but they did want to come. All of them, and Hazelbridge is not nearly as far as Canterbury really, so even Martha was allowed to put on her things, her collar, and come with us. She walked slowly, but we had the day before us, so there was no extra hurry. At Hazelbridge we went into B. Munn's grocer's store and asked for ginger beer to drink. They gave it to us, but they seemed surprised at us wanting to drink it there, and the glass was warm. It had just been washed. We only did it really so as to get into conversation with B. Munn, grocer, and extract information without rousing suspicion. You cannot be too careful. However, when we said it was first-class ginger beer and paid for it, we found it not so easy to extract anything more from B. Munn, grocer. And there was an anxious silence while he fiddled about behind the counter among the tinned meats and sauce bottles, with a fringe of hobnailed boots hanging over his head. It's a very old-fashioned store. I used to work in one a bit like this, and I used to also shop in one years later when we were living in England, And it was wonderful actually living in a village that had an old-fashioned general store. H.O. spoke suddenly. He is like the sort of person who rushes in where angels fear to tread, as Denny says. Say what sort of person that is. He said, I say, you remember driving us home that day? Who paid for the cart? No subtlety. Of course, B. Munn Grocer was not such a nincompoop, I like that word, it means so many people I know, as to say right off. He said, I was paid all right, young gentleman. Don't you terrify yourself. People in Kent say terrify when they mean worry. So Dora shoved in a gentle oar. She said, we want to know the kind lady's name and address so that we can write and thank her for being so jolly that day. B. Munn Grocer muttered something about the lady's address being goods he was often asked for. Alice said, but do tell us, we forgot to ask her. She's a relation of a second-hand uncle of ours, and I do so want to thank her properly. And if you got any extra strong peppermints at a penny an ounce, we should like 1/4 of a pound. This was a masterstroke. While he was weighing out the peppermints, his heart got soft, and just as he was twisting up the corner of the paper bag, Dora said, what lovely fat peppermints. Do tell us. And B. Munn's heart was now quite melted. He said, it's Miss Ashley, and she lives at the Cedars, about a mile down the Maidstone Road. We thanked him, and Alice paid for the peppermints. Oswald was a little anxious when she ordered such a lot. That's 250 grams, that's half a block of butter. In weight, that's a lot of peppermints. Oswald was a little anxious when she ordered such a lot, but she and Noel had got the money all right, and when we were outside on Hazelbridge Green, a good deal of it is gravel really, we stood and looked at each other. Then Dora said, let's go home and write a beautiful letter and all sign it. Oswald looked at the others. Writing is all very well, but it's such a beastly long time to wait for anything to happen afterwards. The intelligent Alice divined his thoughts, and the dentist divined hers. He is not clever enough yet to divine Oswald's, and the two said together, why not go and see her? She did say she would like to see us again some day, Dora replied. So after we had argued a little about it, we went. And before we had gone 100 yards down the dusty road, Martha began to make us wish with all our hearts we had not let her come. She began to limp, just like a pilgrim, who I will not name, did when he had put the split peas in his silly palmering shoes. So we called a halt and looked at her feet. One of them was quite swollen and red. Bulldogs almost always have something the matter with their feet, and it always comes on when least required. They are not the right breed for emergencies. There was nothing for it but to take it in turns to carry her. She is very stout, and you have no idea how heavy she is. A British bulldog is a very solid dog. It would have been quite heavy going. A half-hearted, unadventurous person, I name no names, but Oswald, Alice, Noel, H.O., Dickie, Daisy and Denny will understand me, said, why not go straight home and come another day without Martha? But the rest agreed with Oswald when he said it was only a mile and perhaps we might get a lift home with the poor invalid. Martha was very grateful to us for our kindness. She put her fat white arms around the person's neck who happened to be carrying her. She's very affectionate. But by holding her very close to you, you can keep her from kissing your face all the time. That's licking your face. As Alice said, bulldogs do give you such large, wet, pink kisses. A mile is a good way when you have to take your turn carrying Martha. At last we came to a hedge with a ditch in front of it, and chains swinging from posts to keep people off the grass and out of the ditch, and a gate with "The Cedars" on it in gold letters. All very neat and tidy, and showing plainly that more than one gardener was kept. There we stopped. Alice put Martha down, grunting with exhaustedness, and said, look here, Dora and Daisy, I don't believe a bit that it's his grandmother. I'm sure Dora was right. And it's only his horrid sweetheart. I feel it in my bones. Now, don't you really think we'd better chuck it? We're sure to catch it for interfering. We always do. The cross of true love never did come smooth, said the dentist. We ought to help him to bear his cross. But if we find her for him, and she's not his grandmother, he'll marry her, Dicky said in tones of gloominess and despair. Oswald felt the same, but he said, never mind, we should all hate it, but perhaps Albert's uncle might like it. You can never tell. If you want to do a really unselfish action and no kid, now's your time, my late Wouldbegoods. No one had the face to say right out that they didn't want to be unselfish. But it was with sad hearts that the unselfish seekers opened the long gate and went up the gravel drive between the rhododendrons and other shrubberies towards the house. I think I have explained to you before that the eldest son of anybody is called the representative of the family, as if his father isn't there. This was why Oswald now took the lead. When we got to the last turn of the drive, it was settled that the others were to noiselessly ambush in the rhododendrons, and Oswald was to go on alone and ask at the house for the grandmother from India, I mean Miss Ashley. So he did, but when he got to the front of the house and saw how neat the flower beds were with red geraniums, and the windows all bright and speckless, with muslin blinds and brass rods, and a green parrot in a cage in the porch, and the doorstep newly whited, lying clean and untrodden in the sunshine, he stood still and thought of his boots and how dusty the roads were, and wished he had not gone into the farmyard after eggs before starting that morning. As he stood there in anxious uncertainness, he heard a low voice among the bushes. It said, "Hist! Oswald, here!" And it was the voice of Alice. So he went back to the others among the shrubs, and they all crowded round their leader, full of importable news. "She's not in the house. She's here," Alice said in a low whisper that seemed nearly all S's. "Close by. She went by just this minute with a gentleman. And they're sitting on a seat under a tree on the little lawn, and she's got her head on his shoulder, and he's holding her hand. I never saw anyone look so silly in all my born," Dicky said. "It is sickening," Denny said, trying to look very manly with his legs wide apart, standing there. "I don't know," Oswald whispered. "I suppose it wasn't Albert's uncle." "Not much," Dicky briefly replied. "Then don't you see it's all right? If she's going on like that with this fellow, she'll want to marry him. And Albert's uncle's safe, and we've really done an unselfish action without having to suffer for it afterwards." With a stealthy movement, Oswald rubbed his hands as he spoke in real joyfulness. We decided that we had better bunk unnoticed, but we had reckoned without Martha. She had strolled off, limping, to look about her a bit in the shrubbery. "Where's Martha?" Dora suddenly said. "She went that way," pointingly remarked H.O. "Then fetch her back, you young duffer. What did you let her go for?" Oswald said. "And look sharp. Don't make a row." He went. A minute later we heard a hoarse squeak from Martha, the one she always gives when suddenly collared from behind, and a little squeal in a ladylike voice, and a man say, "Hello!" And then we knew that H.O. had once more rushed in where angels might have thought twice about it. We hurried to the fatal spot, but it was too late. We were just in time to hear H.O. say, "I'm sorry if she frightened you, but we've been looking for you. Are you Albert's uncle's long-lost grandmother?" "No," said Our Lady unhesitatingly. It seemed vain to add 7 more agitated actors to the scene now going on. We stood still. The man was standing up. He was a clergyman, and I found out afterwards he was the nicest we ever knew except our own Mr. Briston at Lewisham, who is now a canon or a dean or something grand that no one ever sees. At present I did not like him. He said, "No, this lady is nobody's grandmother. May I ask in return how long it is since you escaped from the lunatic asylum, my poor child, and whence your keeper is?" H.O. took no notice of this at all, except to say, "I think you're very rude, and not at all funny if you think you are." The lady said, "My dear, remember now, I remember you." The lady said, "My dear, I remember you now perfectly. How are all the others? And are you pilgrims again today?" H.O. does not always H.O. does not always answer questions. He turned to the man and said, "Are you going to marry the lady?" Margaret, said the clergyman, I never thought it would come to this. He asks me my intentions. If you are, said H.O., it's all right, because if you do, Albert's uncle can't, at least not till you're dead, and we don't want him to. Flattering, upon my word, said the clergyman, putting on a deep frown. Shall I call him out, Margaret, for his poor opinion of you, or shall I send for the police? Alice now saw that H.O., though firm, was getting muddled and rather scared. She broke cover and sprang into the middle of the scene. Don't let him rag H.O. any more, she said. It's all our faults. You see, Albert's uncle was so anxious to find you. We thought perhaps you were his long-lost heiress sister, or his old nurse who alone knew the secret of his birth, or something, and we asked him, and he said you were his long-lost grandmother he had known in India. And we thought that must be a mistake, and that you were really his long-lost sweetheart, and we tried to do a really unselfish act and find you for him, because we don't want him to be married at all. It isn't because we don't like you, Oswald cut in, now emerging from the bushes, and if he must marry, we'd sooner it was you than anyone. Really, we would. A generous concession, Margaret, the strange clergyman uttered. Most generous. But the plot thickens. It's almost pea soup-like now. 1 or 2 points clamour for explanation. Who are these visitors of yours? Why this Red Indian method of paying morning calls? Why the lurking attitude of the rest of the tribe, which I now discern among the undergrowth? Won't you ask the rest of the tribe to come out and join the glad throng? Then I liked him better. I always like people who know the same songs as we do, and books and tunes and other things. The others came out. The lady looked very uncomfy, and partly as if she was going to cry, but she couldn't help laughing too, as more and more of us came out, because there's 8 children, remember. And who, the clergyman went on, who in fortune's name is Albert? And who is his uncle? And what have they or you to do in this garden? We all felt rather silly, and I don't think I ever felt more than then. What an awful lot there were of us. 3 years' absence in Calcutta or elsewhere may explain my ignorance of these details, but still. I think we'd better go, said Dora. I'm sorry if we've done anything rude or wrong. We didn't mean to. Goodbye. I hope you'll be happy with the gentleman, I'm sure. I hope so too, said Noel, and I know he was thinking how much nicer Albert's uncle was. We turned to go. The lady had been very silent compared with what she was when she pretended to show us Canterbury, but now she seemed to shake off some dreamy silliness and caught hold of Dora by the shoulder. No, dear, no, she said, it's all right, and you must have some tea. We'll have it on the lawn. John, don't tease them any more. Albert's uncle is the gentleman I told you about, and, my dear children, this is my brother that I haven't seen for 3 years. Then he's a long lost too, said H.O. The lady said, not now, and smiled at him, and the rest of us were dumb with confounding emotions. Oswald was particularly dumb. He might have known it was her brother, because in rotten grown-up books, if a girl kisses a man in a shrubbery, then it's not the man you think she's in love with. It always turns out to be a brother, though generally the disgrace of the family, and not a respectable clergyman from Calcutta. The lady now turned to her reverend and surprising brother and said, John, go and tell them we'll have tea on the lawn. When he was gone, she stood quite still a minute. Then she said, I'm going to tell you something. But I want to put you on your honour, not to talk about it to other people. You see, it isn't everyone I would tell about it. He, Albert's uncle I mean, has told me a lot about you, and I know I can trust you. We said, yes. Oswald with a brooding sentiment of knowing all too well what was coming next. The lady then said, though I am not Albert's uncle's grandmother, I did know him in India once, and we were going to be married, but we had a misunderstanding. Quarrel? Row? Said Noel and H.O. at once. Well, yes, a quarrel, and he went away. He was in the Navy then, and then, well, we were both sorry, but well, anyway, when his ship came back, we'd gone to Constantinople, then to England, and he couldn't find us. And he says he's been looking for me ever since. Not you for him, said Noel. Well, perhaps, said the lady, and the girls said, ah, with deep interest. The lady went on more quickly, and then I found you, and then he found me, and now I must break it to you. Try to bear up. She stopped. The branches cracked, and Albert's uncle was in our midst. He took off his hat. Excuse my tearing my hair, he said to the lady, but has the pack really hunted you down? It's all right, she said, and when she looked at him, she got miles prettier, quite suddenly. I was just breaking to them. Don't take that proud privilege from me, he said. Kiddies, allow me to present you to the future Mrs. Albert's uncle, or shall we say, Albert's new aunt. There was a good deal of explaining done before tea, about how we got there, and why, but after the first bitterness of disappointment, we felt not nearly so sorry as we had expected to. For Albert's uncle's lady was very jolly to us, and her brother was awfully decent and showed us a lot of first-class native curiosities and things, unpacking them on purpose, skins of beasts and beads and brass things and shells from different savage lands besides India, and the lady told the girls that she hoped they would like her as much as she liked them, and if they wanted a new aunt, she would do her best to give satisfaction in the new situation. And Alice thought of the Murdstone aunt belonging to Daisy and Denny, and how awful it would have been if Albert's uncle had married her. She's really, really tough and cross. That's why Albert and Denny and Alice were such white mice. And she told me afterwards that we might think ourselves jolly lucky it was no worse. That's what Alice was thinking. Then the lady led Oswald aside, pretending to show him the parrot, which he had explored thoroughly before, and told him she was not like some people in books. When she was married, she would never try to separate her husband from his bachelor friends. She only wanted them to be her friends as well. Then there was tea, and thus all ended in amicableness, and the Reverend and Friendly drove us home in a wagonette. But for Martha, we shouldn't have had tea, or explanations, or lift, or anything. So we honoured her and did not mind her being so heavy, and walking up and down constantly on our laps as we drove home. And that is all the story of the long-lost grandmother and Albert's uncle. I'm afraid it is rather dull, but it was very important to him, so I felt it ought to be narrated. Stories about lovers and getting married are generally slow. I like a love story where the hero parts with the girl at the garden gate in the gloaming and goes off and has adventures, and you don't see her any more till he comes home to marry her at the end of the book. And I suppose people have to marry. Albert's uncle is awfully old, more than 30, and the lady is advanced in years, 26 next Christmas. Considered so old back then, especially by children. They are to be married then. The girls are next Christmas. They are to be married then. The girls are to be bridesmaids in white frocks with fur. This quite consoles them. If Oswald repines sometimes, he hides it. What's the use? We all have to meet our fell destiny, and Albert's uncle is not extirpated from this awful law. Now the finding of the long lost was the very last thing we did, for the sake of its being a noble act. So that is the end of the Wouldbegoods, and there are no more chapters after this. But Oswald hates books that finish up without telling you how the things you might want to know about the people in the books. So here goes. We went home to the beautiful Blackheath house. It seemed very stately and mansion-like after the moat house, and everyone was most frightfully pleased to see us. Mrs. Pettigrew cried when we went away. I never was so astonished in my life. She made each of the girls a fat red pincushion like a heart, and each of us boys had a knife bought out of the housekeeper's own money. Bill Simpkins is happy as a sub-under-gardener to Albert's uncle's lady's mother. They do keep 3 gardeners. I knew they did. That's the house that they visited her at, the one with the really fancy garden. And our tramp still earns enough to sleep well on from our dear old pigman. Our last 3 days were entirely filled up with visits of farewell sympathy to all our many friends who were so sorry to lose us. We promised to come and see them next year. I hope we shall. Denny and Daisy went back to live with their father at Forest Hill. I don't think they'll ever be again the victims of the Murdstone aunt, who is really a great aunt, and about twice as much in the autumn of her days as our new Albert's uncle aunt. I think they plucked up spirit. Sorry. I think they plucked up spirit enough to tell their father they didn't like her, which they never thought of doing before. Our own Robber says their holidays in the country did them both a great deal of good. They are the children of their Robber from the first book. If you want to know what happened, go to my YouTube channel and look for the story of the treasure seekers. And that's in there. That's in one of them. That's how they get to know. They don't get to know Alice and Denny. They get to know they get to know the uncle, the father of the children. Sorry, not the uncle, the father of the children. Our own Robber says their holidays in the country did them both a great deal of good, and he says us Bastables have certainly taught Daisy and Denny the rudiments of the art of making home happy. I believe they have thought of several quite new naughty things entirely on their own, and done them too since they came back from the moat house. Well, because they were such good children, so he's proud of them. Oswald's proud of them. I wish you didn't grow up so quickly. Oswald can see that ere long he will be too old for the kind of games we can all play, and he feels grown-upness creeping inordiously upon him. But enough of this. And now, gentle reader, farewell. If anything in these chronicles of the Woudlbegoods should make you try to be good yourself, the author will be very glad, of course. But take my advice, and don't make a society for trying in. It is much easier without. And do try to forget that Oswald has another name besides Bastable, the one beginning with C, I mean. Perhaps you have not noticed what it was. If so, don't look back for it. It is a name no manly boy would like to be called by, if he spoke the truth. Oswald is said to be a very manly boy, and he despises the name, and will never give it to his own son when he has one, not if a rich relative offered to leave him an immense fortune. If he did, Oswald would still be firm. He would, on the honour of the house of Bastable. And that's the end of the story. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of the stories, and I shall see you next time. And I'm not quite sure yet what I'm going to read. Actually, I'll just have a quick look in my book list here and see if I've got anything that I thought was particularly appealing for the next story. No. Children of the New Forest is a bit long for the moment, and it's a bit serious. I'm after something a bit more fun. Anyway, tune in next time, which is 2 days from now, and I will read you and I'll start another story. So we'll see you then. Bye.